Bring it back. Okay, let's get this. Chapter 12. Okay. First question we need to deal with. What did Mendel actually discover about genetics? What did Mendel actually discover about genetics? Well, the first thing came from our quiz, and that's what? That blended inheritance is not the correct model of inheritance. So this is the idea of blended inheritance. I don't know if you got a really good sense of what that was. So the idea was that every cell in your body leaks particles. They called these gimmules. So every cell in your body leaks gimmules, and those gimmules go and they concentrate in your gonads and then get deposited into your gametes. And so then the same thing is happening with the pair, right? With your mate, where they're doing the same thing. Every cell in their body is releasing gimmules that are concentrated in the gametes. And so that when the two gametes fuse together, it's really a question of how many of your gimmules did you put into your gamete, right? Because you could have put more than your partner did. And then which particular gimmules made it in. Because maybe only the gimmules from certain parts of your body made it in, but not other parts. And so you get kind of a combined factor of this, and you get a mixing because of that. That's the idea of blended inheritance. And so Mendel discovered that it actually doesn't work. He discovered the idea of blended inheritance. And because what he found was that's not the case at all, that things actually rather travel in very predictable ways, and that they tend to come in pairs. And so he really lucked out studying pea plants. He studied some other organisms trying to confirm his findings with pea plants, and it didn't work. But pea plants are really nice, and every character he used in the pea plants, would it be flower color, seed shape, flower shape, all of those features, they were all on different chromosomes. And so he really lucked out, and they all were inherited based on normal principles, which is very unusual as well. So he really lucked out with pea plants. Plus they grow super fast, very easy to keep alive, really hard to kill. And then when you're done with it, they make food, right? I mean, it's just like you get to do all this research and then you get to eat it, right? Make some split pea soup, and it's awesome. And so he focused on these heritable features, and he basically discovered that things don't blend, right? You don't blend some of your features as you're making your gametes. Instead, characters, would it be eye color? We've got to use pea plants. Sorry, he didn't talk about eye color. Would it be flower color, seed shape, plant height? Those are characters, and that those characters are passed in very discrete factors. It's not like maybe a little bit of this height and a little bit of that height, depending on which cell it came from. No, they come in very discrete factors that he called genes. And that these appear unchanged. They're not blended. Right? If you cross a tall plant with a short plant, you don't get an intermediate sized plant. You get one or the other. If you have normal patterns of inheritance. But we know it's not quite always the case, which is why they had these ideas of blended inheritance. So the character is like, again, flower color, seed shape, plant height. A trait is the particular flavor of that character, right? And so if it's flower color, it's pink or white, or purple or white, whatever the particular colors are. Or if it's plant height, it's short or tall, or it's wrinkled or smooth, or it's yellow seeds or green seeds. Okay, those are the traits. Okay, and so he discovered basically that these characters pass from parent to offspring in discrete factors. They don't get blended. They don't get changed, but they oftentimes disappear in that first generation, in that F1. And we see that right here, right? So here are the parents. Here's a brown hair, brown-eyed father and a blonde hair, blue-eyed mother, and their offspring are all going to be brown hair, brown eyes. If It was normal inheritance patterns for that, but we know it's not, so it's not always going to be the case. But so the blonde hair and the blue eyes would disappear in this generation, only to come back in the next generation. Only to come back. All right? Any questions about this question? About what Mendel did?
What got him interested in studying these things?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. He studied a lot of science, and a lot of monks did, because monks would study theology, but they would also need to live. I mean, they'd have to provide their own living. They'd usually be paid some by the state. This was during a time in which the state and the church were connected, so they'd be paid some, but they needed to be able to fund things. So they would often set up gardens and do all sorts of various things, and so they would study these as a means to improve what was going on, but also they just tended to be really intelligent and insanely curious people. So, I mean, and he lived in a monastery. It's like, it's not, it's not like it's like the center point of hustle and bustle. There's lots of time on your hands. Yeah.
I heard that he wasn't really recognized right away.
Oh, that is certainly true. I mean, it was decades, but he published his work right away. But it was decades before people really recognized the importance of what was happening.
So who figured out that he was right?
Dobzhansky and some other molecular biologists in the early 1900s.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So the next question we need to deal with is this one. What is a one-character cross? What is a one-character cross? Because this is really where he determined one of his two principles that he discovered, and this was the law of segregation. The law of segregation. So what is a one-character cross? All right, so the character we're going to talk about is flower color. So that is the character. The traits are purple and white, right? Character is flower color. Traits are purple and white. So here's a little bit about the floral anatomy of a pea plant. That's not what we're going to focus on. And here are the particular traits. So here's a purple flower, and here is a white flower. And so what he did actually something really, really clever, because plants will often self-fertilize. They're self-pollinate. But he didn't want that to happen. So for some plants, he would cut out the female portion of the flower, and in other plants, he would cut out the male portion of the flower. And so he could actually he could keep self-pollination from happening. And it would only happen when he really wanted to happen. He could control where all the reproduction was happening. This was part of the reason why he wasn't able to confirm his study using some other organisms. Plus, he tried to use honeybees. And I don't know if you know about the genetics of honeybees, but male honeybees are haploid. They only have one copy of the genome, and females are diploid. They have two copies of the genome, which just messes everything up. It just messes everything up. That's why the males get kicked out of the hive before the winter, and then they freeze to death, because they only have one copy of the genome. It's disgusting. That's not really why they get kicked out. It's because their usefulness has run its course. The females are the workers. The queen's going to produce more. She's got plenty of sperm from the males. All right. So here's the one character cross for the flowers. And so you cross a purple and a white flower. Here's the parental. In the F1, all of them are purple. It's not a blend. It's not like you get a lighter purple by blending the purple and the white. That's what blended inheritance would predict. But instead, you get all purple. And so it's those factors, those traits are continuing. They're not getting blended or distorted. They may disappear. But then when you cross individuals from F1, the white trait reappears. It comes back. It shows back up in the F2 generation and in very predictable ratios. Yeah, Kinsey.
So they're all purple because purple's the dominant.
Purple's the dominant. Yep, so purple is dominant to white. And so every individual in the F1, if you cross a purple and a white, has one purple allele and one white, but all you need is one purple to be purple. Yep. And then so it's basically this setup here. So you would have purple except for we only have one gene here, so we'd have purple and white. And then so this individual here can make two different types of gametes, one that had the purple and one that had the white. And then if you cross them with individuals that are the same, that can make one purple or one white, you get very predictable ratios. And your predictable ratios in your F2 where you cross those F1. So in a one character cross, you always cross homozygous individuals. you cross a homozygous dominant with a homozygous recessive. In this case, we did 2 characters, but in this one, we're doing a 1-character cross. Okay, so you would cross a homozygous recessive with a homozygous dominant. So your F1, they're all going to be heterozygous, have 1 dominant, 1 recessive. And then still, to finish that 1-character cross, you cross 2 of the heterozygous individuals. And we call these monohybrids because they're heterozygous at 1 locus. So they're monohybrids. And then they're going to produce offspring that have both traits and in very predictable ratios, about 3 to 1. You see how close that is to 3 to 1? 3.15 to 1 is what he found. Yeah.
How did he know that they're homozygous?
Because they were true breeding. So they always made, so he would take only like the purple flowered plants that always produced purple flowered offspring. No, they never produced anything else. So there would be some purple flower plants that would produce some purple flowered offspring and some white flowered offspring. He didn't use those. He used the ones that only produce all entirely purple flowers. And then the white flowered plants that produce entirely white flowers. So they're true breeding individuals. Yeah.
So he already had an assumption, or at least an understanding of that each plant had 2 potentially different or similar. He understood.
Well, he understood that there was difference, right? He could see the phenotypic difference, and that's what everybody could understand as well when they were thinking about inheritance and they were thinking about this blending. They could still see that, right? And no matter what you were crossing, but at that point in time, artificial selection in pigeons was really popular. I mean, people were generating different breeds of pigeons for different tasks, and so that was really popular. So they pretty well understood that you could see individuals with different phenotypes, and that they would produce offspring with different combinations. But nobody had done the work controlled enough to actually demonstrate how the inheritance actually works, that it wasn't blended. All right, so this is for all 7 characters. And so there was seed shape, seed color, pod shape, pod color, flower position, stem length. Okay, 7 characters, and they happen to all be on 7 separate chromosomes, which is fantastic because you know how many chromosomes pea plants have? 7. Right? Isn't that fantastic? Just really lucked out there. His data were so good that and still are so good that people actually accuse him of falsifying these data. There's like, man, that's just too good. Like, there's no way you can actually get that to happen. But he kept really, really good records, and so it looks like, man, he just really chose a really good model organism and worked for a number of years. All right, does that make sense? 1 character cross. So what is a 1 character cross? We do this with true breeding individuals. So they produce offspring that always bear their traits as long as they again mate with individuals that have the same traits. And we already mentioned this, because they self-fertilize. He had to cut off the anthers of the flowers to prevent crosses and to control which individuals fertilized which individuals. We already mentioned this. F1 generation. I had all of the F1 generation had only the characteristic of the dominant parent. Only one of the characteristics. So one of the 2 traits disappeared for all of his crosses in the F1 generation. And then when he allowed F1 generations to self-fertilize or to fertilize with other F1 individuals, this you call a monohybrid cross again, a cross between individuals that are heterozygous at 1 locus. That what you get is that white flower reappears. All right, so that's a 1 character cross. We need to talk about his law of segregation or principle of segregation. We'll actually end our time there, and I'll give you back your exams, and if leaving a little bit of time for you to ask any questions that you might have. All right, any question about this question before we move on and talk about law of segregation? Yeah, I can wait just a moment. So as we think about Mendel, and the first question asks, what did Mendel actually do? The best way to answer that question would be saying he did 2 things. One is he showed blended inheritance wasn't true. And the other thing is he determined 2 laws. of inheritance. So he showed that blended inheritance is not true, and he demonstrated 2 laws of inheritance. And the first of those laws is called the law of segregation, or the principle of segregation. And that's what we'll deal with first. The other law is called the law of independent assortment, or the principle of independent assortment. It has to do when you have multiple characters. All right, so what is the principle of segregation? What is the principle of segregation? All right, so let's go back to this one character cross. Here's our P generation. We would call these individuals true breeding Y. Right, and so they produce offspring that have their trait always. So the character is flower color, and this particular character has 2 different traits, purple or white. Okay? True breeding individuals, as long as you cross a purple individual with itself or with another purple flowered individual, if it's true breeding, it'll always produce purple flowered offspring. Same thing for the white flowered offspring. And so what the principle of segregation says is that at a point at which these organisms are making gametes, by the time Mendel started doing this work, people pretty well understood what was going on with fertilization. You had some cells that were deposited from the male into the female. They had pretty well understood. And so what he determined was that at the point at which you make these gametes, you only get to put one of your 2 traits into there. One of your 2 alleles for that particular gene into your gamete. And so if both your alleles are the same, then you can only make one type of gamete. But if you have 2 different alleles, then you can make 2 different types of gametes, but they don't blend. You don't make gametes that are part purple and part white. You make either a gamete that's purple or a gamete that is white. And so this is basically the principle of segregation, or the law of segregation, that a purple flowered individual that is true breeding can only make gametes with that purple trait. And if they aren't true breeding, then they can make gametes that have the purple trait or the white trait. And that they segregate. Those 2 factors segregate from each other in the gamete formation. And so then when you fuse a gamete from a true breeding individual with a gamete from a recessive individual, you get an individual that has 1 dominant and 1 recessive, but they're going to express the dominant trait. So all it takes is 1 copy of it. And then when you allow for that monohybrid cross, now you have individuals that can produce 2 different types of gametes. One with the dominant and one with the recessive. Man, all of these factors in this one, they're all using lowercase p until you get down into here. So, but this individual can produce 2 different types of gametes, one with the dominant, one with the recessive. This individual can produce 2 different types of gametes due to the law of segregation, one with the dominant, one with the recessive. And then so in this combination, dominant, you get a true breeding dominant individual. In this cross here, you get dominant and recessive, but you still have at least 1 copy of the dominant trait. So you get the dominant phenotype. This individual here, dominant or recessive with dominant, you get at least 1 copy of the dominant trait, and so you get the dominant phenotype. Here is the only way you get a white flowered individual, when both parents give a gamete with the recessive allele. And so 3 out of every 4 offspring produced are going to demonstrate the dominant trait. All right? But if they didn't segregate, if the 2 alleles didn't segregate during the process of gamete formation, you would never be able to preserve the parental traits. You'd instead get a blend, right? But if you preserve the parental traits, they're either purple or white. There's no light purple, then there's no blending of factors, right? The parental factors are maintained, are preserved, okay? Make sense? Okay. Any questions on that question? Take some time to hand back your exams. So your grades are on Canvas. They have been for a little while. I usually don't like to do that, but I didn't want you to have to wait all the way until today to see what your grade was. The average on this midterm was quite a bit higher than the average on the first midterm, but there were some people that did worse on this midterm than on the previous midterm. The range was kind of all over the place. The lowest score wasn't as low as it was on the first midterm, but the highest score was actually a little bit higher on this midterm than on the first one. I think the average on this midterm was right around 80%. It was like 79.8%. But the median was, I think, 83%, meaning half of the class scored an 83 or above. If, again, and I'm going to tell you this, I told you this before your first midterm, if I made a mistake adding up your score, you need to let me know, because I don't know that there's a mistake unless you let me know. And if you don't understand why something was scored some way, feel free to ask. And if you don't know what you could do to do better on the final exam, we need to start meeting. So I've been meeting actually weekly with some of the people in here, and I'm happy to do that, but I'm not gonna come find you, right? I love you enough to let you do whatever you think is best. Okay? Yeah.
Are there like notes?
Are there notes?
Yeah, like